Hello, my name is Hazlani, and this is my presentation on media and crime. To start off with the first question, what was your reaction or feelings about the influence of mass media on the perceptions of crime and deviance? I wanted to start with a quote I found in the third article labeled "The Influence of Exposure to Depictions of Race and Crime in TV News on Viewers' Social Judgments." Found on page 615, it states, and I quote, "Media exposure contributes to the construction and perpetuation of these perceptions by disproportionately depicting racial/ethnic minorities as criminal suspects and whites as victims in television news." Mass media, specifically here we're talking about TV news on the TV, purposefully overrepresents Black males as criminals and not as often as victims. Because of this injustice, they create stereotypes and a heightened fear of victimization by minorities. I was shocked to read this, particularly coming from the largest minority group, which are Mexicans. Growing up, I've always heard many stories involving crimes between relatives and white individuals. Of course, there have also been cases in regards with our own race or other ethnicities. But if I were to tally up all these incidents and make a chart, statistically, they'd be about equal. So, if that's the case, then why aren't they represented as often? Why aren't whites being broadcasted as often as African Americans? It's devastating to see the influence mass media has and its contribution to injustice and prejudices. I also wanted to mention from the second article titled "Mental Disorder and Violence: An Empirical Picture in Context." Mass media has influenced assumptions that madness and violence are linked. Found on page 13 of this article, I quote, "The sane have stereotyped the mad as violent." The media selectively reports psychiatric patients as perpetrators of violence instead of as victims. It's heartbreaking to hear that those with medical disorders and ailments are being blamed and taken advantage of. Media tries to pin crime on these individuals labeled as deviant, when in reality, they're victims. Mass media ostracizes and tries to pin crimes on these individuals, trying to put them behind bars. Instead, they should be more focused on helping and supporting those who can't fully help themselves. For the second question, do you believe mass media creates unwarranted levels of fear of crime in society? Definitely. The book portrayed Jack the Ripper and the moral panic the media caused. In 1888, there was no internet, but that didn't stop the press. To quote from the book, "Newspapers did what they could to promote or even inflame residents' fear and anxieties at the time of the killings. The media created rumors or even exaggerated what they knew." Also found on page 189, fear sold more newspapers. They didn't care about the high levels of fear people would get from reading their papers. This led to communities turning on each other, pointing fingers at anyone suspicious, blaming someone from another part of society. In the fourth article, labeled "Construction of the Crack Mother Icon," NAPARE, in other words, the National Association for Prenatal Addiction, reported around 375,000 cases of babies exposed to crack cocaine. The media ran with this, and in turn, I quote, "annihilated a widespread frenzy about a crack epidemic," when in fact, experts estimated a max of 100,000 babies were actually exposed to crack cocaine. This was an exaggeration of more than 200%, which caused a sort of mass hysteria in society. They targeted African American women. Also found on page 269, the media left the impression that the pregnant addict is typically a Black woman. Because of this, there was more crime pinned on the crack mother. Black women were scared to get help for fear of being incarcerated. Question 3. How do the perceptions of crime reinforce social labels and stereotypes in society? In the first article, Crime Cultivation, Comparisons Across Media Genres and Channels, they surveyed 505 adults. Of these 505, 74% estimated or predicted that crimes committed by non-Caucasians was higher than 45%. They believe that minorities cause nearly half of all violent crimes. This creates stereotypes and generates social labels. These minorities are being labeled aggressive, problematic, dangerous, and hostile, to name a few. In the textbook found on page 56, it can even become a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating deviance that would otherwise not occur. If they're constantly being told something their whole life, you start to believe it and become what they say you are. Basically, our perceptions of crime in society is strengthening social labels and stereotypes we've created. Question number 4. What are the most important ideas, concepts, or research presented in the articles compared to the information in the textbook by John Cura and data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics website? Compare and contrast. So one of the most important research breakthroughs was in the third article, the influence of exposure to depictions of race and crime in TV news on viewers' social judgments. Here, it stated that 74% of rape victims were white female. 88% of these crimes are interracial, meaning the victim and the rapist were of the same race. To quote from page 619 of this article, the majority of reported sexual assault and rapes involve a white perpetrator and a white victim. This was mind-boggling to me. There are so many stereotypes associating Blacks with criminal activity. I found it in a way too good to be true. I wanted to compare it to the BJS website, but I didn't know when the stat was recorded, where the research was conducted, or over what period of time. Where I found this quote, they cited Barrett and George 2005. I've kind of went stalker mode and find the book they got their information from, called Race, Culture, Psychology, and Law. It was published in Thousand Oaks, California in 2005. I read a summary on one of the chapters where they stated, during the last 5 years, I had no reason to believe they got their research from Thousand Oaks other than where it was published, but I had nothing else to lose. I had all the information I needed to input into the website. In the arrest data analysis tool, I selected California, Thousand Oaks, and for the offense, I picked forcible rape. In the article, it specifically said rape and sexual assault. So I didn't want to pick aggravated assault or other assault because it didn't quite fit into the category. Seeing as they said during the last 5 years, I 100% assumed that they did their research in Thousand Oaks. So since they said during the last 5 years, I took information from the years 2000 to 2005 so I could get some sort of an analysis I could compare. What I found were, in the year 2000, there were 4 arrests made. All 4 were white. In 2001, 1 arrest was made. They were white. In 2002, 4 arrests were made. 2 were white. 1 was African American and 1 was Asian. In 2003, 3 arrests were made. All were white. In 2004, 4 arrests were made. They were all white. And finally, in 2005, 6 arrests were made, and they were all white. 20 out of the 22 arrests were by a white individual. This is roughly 90%. If we compare the 90% to the 88% they had mentioned, it's pretty close. To sort of contradict, however, I looked into the demographics of Thousand Oaks during this period of time. In the year 2000, there was a population of 74% being white. In 2005, it went down to about 65%. If more than half of the population were white, of course the crimes committed were majority whites. Again, this is an assumption, assuming they got research from Thousand Oaks. But another contradictory statement that I found in the book on page 219, and I quote, "Easier for a man to muster if a potential rape victim belongs to a class that he dislikes, depersonalizes, and condemns. Typically, men look for someone in a different social class or someone they don't entirely relate to. Basically, they look for victims that can motivate and neutralize doubts they may have." Going back to the article, they said that crimes were convicted by intraracial individuals, which kind of raises suspicions over the claims. For the final question, discuss which theoretical perspective best describe the influence of mass media on the social perception of crime and deviant behavior. All 3 theoretical perspectives did a good job describing how we function as a society, but the one I think describes influence of mass media on social perceptions of crime and deviant behavior best is symbolic interactionism. As I had aforementioned, fear sells. The media is prone to put a label on everything. They want to add juicy details and exaggerate the truth. Constantly hearing African Americans labeled as criminals, Mexicans as lazy, and other stereotypes sort of puts it into fruition. If we hear it enough, we start to believe it. You start to overanalyze how you see yourself and others in the community, in the world. They make statements, and we in turn fulfill their expectations. Growing up in a Mexican household, seeing that Mexicans are depicted as field workers and not furthering their education. Then we see our families and notice similarities. We start to think they're correlated. Is there some truth in what they're saying? Do they go hand in hand? To conclude, symbolic interactionism is used in mass media to recognize how crime and deviant behaviors are perceived. Thank you.